All right, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you here today. We've got a little bit bigger crowd this week. I know we've had some folks that have been battling sickness, and we have several back with us today, and we're grateful for your presence, and we certainly thank God for those answered prayers. I know we have some visitors. We usually do every week, and we're especially grateful for your presence. If you can, maybe stay around after services are over for a few minutes. Allow us the opportunity to introduce ourselves and to get to know you just a little bit better. But we're glad that everybody's here. And for those that are joining us online, we're grateful for your presence as well. When Franklin Roosevelt was president, perhaps his most trusted advisor was a man by the name of Harry Hopkins. And his influence, Hopkins' influence, was at its greatest during World War II. And what was interesting is, during this time, Hopkins held no cabinet position whatsoever. He didn't have an official government position. He wasn't a part of Roosevelt's cabinet. He was simply a trusted advisor to him. And because of that, there were many that kind of saw him as this shadowy, dark, sinister kind of fellow. One day, Roosevelt was in the Oval Office, and one of his political foes had come to meet with him. And he asked Roosevelt, he said, "Why do you trust this guy? Why do you allow him so much influence?" He said, "You have to know that people don't trust him, and as a result, he's a liability to you." And Roosevelt's answer to him was this. He said, "You know, one day you may sit in this very chair that I'm sitting in. And as you sit here, there'll be a lot of people that come through that door." And he pointed to the door into the Oval Office. And he said, "Everybody that comes through that door wants something." And he said, as you sit in this chair, you'll want someone like Hopkins, who has no other desire than simply to serve. Interesting statement, isn't it? I would have to imagine that when you're in a position like the President of the United States, or anyone that has a position with that much power, it must be difficult to find people that you can trust that simply want to serve for what they consider to be the greater good. And I guess the truth is, really in any aspect of life, it's hard to find people that simply want to serve, expecting nothing in return. For the past few weeks, as Tony pointed out when he was leading our songs, and he aligned the songs around this theme of discipleship, we've been engaged in this study of discipleship. And we've looked at who is Jesus. If we're to follow him, then we need to try to the best of our ability to understand who he is and see him for who he truly is. We talked about some traits of a good follower. If we're going to follow him, we need to understand, what does it take to be a good follower? This week, I want us to consider the idea of servant, of being a servant, by focusing on this statement, "Lord, make me a servant." To do that, I would ask you to open your Bibles with me to John chapter 13. John chapter 13. We spent some time here in John chapter 13 in our auditorium Bible class this morning, and if you were here, I told you that our lesson would primarily focus from this passage, the opening verses in John chapter 13. And we want to use this, and we're going to combine it with another passage here in a moment, to see if there aren't some things that we can learn about discipleship and service and the importance of that element. Let's start reading in verse 1. "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, 'Lord, do you wash my feet?' Jesus answered him, 'What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand.' Peter said to him, 'You shall never wash my feet.' Jesus answered him, 'If I do not wash you, you have no share with me.' Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, the one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he had said, not all of you are clean. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garment and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. As you and I look at this passage, I want us to consider a few things. And the first thing I want us to think about is this. Let's look at the issue at hand. And in order to appreciate the issue and what leads up to this incredible act of service, I want to ask you to place a marker here and turn back to Luke's Gospel, to Luke chapter 22. You know, the Gospels are interesting. Each Gospel was written by a specific individual to a specific group of people for a specific purpose. And not every Gospel tells every story the same or even includes every detail. You see, they're meant to complement each other. There's a harmony that exists between the Gospels so you and I, so you and I can see the fullest picture possible of Jesus. And in Luke chapter 22, there's background information that's not included in John's Gospel that I believe is incredibly important in order for you and me to appreciate John chapter 13. In Luke chapter 22, Strider read these very words found in verses 14 through 23, or at least verses 20, as we gathered around the Lord's table. And we see Jesus in the final moments of his life. And as he comes together to observe this final Passover meal, he institutes the Lord's Supper as well. All right, hang on, I got a tickle in my throat. All right, I'll try to move that mic so it doesn't blow everybody out. And he comes together to observe this final Passover meal, and he institutes the Lord's Supper. And you can picture the scene as it's unfolding. Jesus knows what's coming. He knows it's the final hours of his life. And he's brought together those that he's closest to share with them. And it's at this moment that Jesus needs their strength, but yet here's what we're going to see beginning in verse number 24. After he shares this Lord's Supper with them, it says, a dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I'm among you as the one who serves. You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I assign to you, as my Father assigned to me, a kingdom, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Can you imagine this scene with me for just a moment? I mean, Jesus is sharing in the final hours of his life, and he wants to share in this Passover meal, and he shares with them the institution of the Lord's Supper. And in this peaceful moment, the peace is utterly shattered by this incredible dispute amongst the apostles. Who's going to be the greatest in this kingdom that the Messiah is bringing? You know, it's interesting. This is not the first time they've argued over this. In fact, if we were to turn back in Luke's Gospel a few pages to Luke chapter 9, we would find this exact same argument amongst the apostles once again. And this time, Jesus would take a child, and he would sit that child in the midst of them, and he would tell them, whoever receives a child like this receives me, and whoever rejects him rejects me. You see, this wasn't a new debate that just all of a sudden sprung up amongst the apostles. And we don't know exactly what brought it on at this particular moment. Maybe it was the way they were seated around the table. Maybe it was the reality that was starting to sink in, that Jesus' final hours were here, and their view of the kingdom was utterly distraught. It wasn't what it should have been. They still longed for this earthly kingdom that they thought the Messiah would bring, and they thought there would be this opportunity for some type of political power, as it were, in the kingdom. But can you imagine the heaviness of heart that Jesus must have experienced? He's just given 3 years of his life trying to teach these men what it means, what the kingdom means, what his Messiah meant, what his kingship would really be about. And yet here they are, even at the very end, arguing at this moment that should have been peaceful, at a moment when Jesus needed their strength, about who's going to be the greatest. They still struggled with this concept of me and what was in it for them to some degree. And Jesus says, you don't get it. My kingdom's not a physical kingdom. Don't think on an earthly level. Don't think like the Gentiles who exercise authority over you and have positions, and some are called benefactors. You see, that's not what my kingdom's all about, Jesus says. He says it's not to be that way with you. It's not about who's greatest. It's not about who has power. He says it's about ultimately the one who serves. And he gives them hope. He tells them that I've got a special place for you in my kingdom. But you see, that's the issue that the apostles are struggling with. That's the issue here in this upper room somewhere in Jerusalem, is Jesus is wanting to share with them in this special moment. The silence, the peace, everything is shattered by this petty argument that has existed prior to now and continues even to the end of Jesus' life about who's going to be the greatest. Now turn back with me to John chapter 13. Because you see, that's the background to the illustration that Jesus provides that we read about just a moment ago. It was that moment, it was that arguing about who's going to be the greatest that ultimately led Jesus to the greatest act of service by a leader this world has ever seen. I want you to notice a few things with me from here in John chapter 13. I want you to notice a few things about Jesus. Verse 1 says that he knew his hour had come. Don't miss that detail. Don't let that detail lose sight of what's happening in the moment. You see, Jesus was very well aware of everything that was about to transpire in the coming hours. Jesus knew his ministry had served a purpose. He knew that God's plan, ever since the beginning of time, was now about to come to fruition. He knew the cross was imminent. He knew that the physical pain and the humiliation and the torture that he was about to face was there. He knew all of those things. He also knew that he was about to leave the 12 men that he had invested in for the last 3 years. And everything from chapter 13 through chapter 17 is about him sharing and strengthening and comforting them. I find that fascinating. Who should have needed the strengthening more than anybody? Should have been Jesus, shouldn't it? Jesus was the one that was about to suffer to the greatest degree, but yet here he is once again giving to other people. And notice what he says. He says, it's not only what he knew, it's the action that he is going to express. Again, this is the latter part of verse number 1. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. He loved them to the end of his life, but he loved them to the end in the sense of the fullest way possible. There was no aspect of love that Jesus had that he didn't feel or that he wouldn't display for these men. We talked about in our Bible class this morning loving one another. And if we would go just a little bit further in John chapter 13, Jesus would give them this new command to love one another. He would say, as I have loved you. Think about that now in the context of what we've read about here in the opening verses of chapter 13. You see, it's not just loving them to the point of death, to the cross. It's not just loving them in the fullest way possible. It's loving them to the point that I will serve you regardless of what's happening even in my own life. And then notice too the third thing here. It's not just his knowledge, it's not just his love, but verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into His hands. You see, Jesus has this power. Everything had been given into His hands at this moment. Jesus knows what's coming. He knows there's no other way. And He has this power now. There's a song maybe you're familiar with that we sing sometimes. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set Him free. There's anything that Jesus could do at this moment with this power. He had full authority and power to do whatever He wants. But yet, what does He do with that power? He washes the disciples' feet. Let that sink in for just a moment. Here's someone that had the most power of anyone that ever lived. He was God in flesh. He had the ability to call on that at any moment. And all of this had been given now to Him. And in the moment when He has this, He uses that power to serve. But as we look at how we serve, there's some significant things that we need to understand about that too. It says He rose from supper and He laid aside His outer garments. And He took a towel and He tied it around His waist. And again, I think for us in our culture, we may lose some of the significance of what that represented. To us, maybe it just seems that He just got comfortable in order to get down on His feet. And maybe if He got wet, that was a more comfortable attire to have on. But you see, that's not the case. What Jesus did in His attire, the way that He dressed Himself to perform this, meant that He took on literally the appearance of a slave. And in fact, this type of attire would have been despised and looked down upon by the Jews. And it's interesting because everything that's needed to do this act of service is readily available. It's all there. The basin, the towels, the water, everything that's needed is there. Yet no one at that table was willing to get up and do what needed to be done except Jesus. Because you see, this was a custom that they were all familiar with. It would have been the custom of the day that when guests came for dinner, that they would have washed their feet. And it served actually a couple of purposes. One, they traveled on dirt roads and rocky roads and sandy roads, and they wore sandals, and it provided just comfort to them. But another practical aspect is when they ate, they actually reclined at the table together. And they would lean on their elbows. So literally, as you were leaning, somebody's feet were pretty close to your face and to your head. And so it provided cleanliness for that as well. But you see, the person that performed that task was typically a household servant or slave. So Jesus shows His vulnerability even in the way that He dresses to perform this task. And He pours water in the basin and He begins to wash the disciples' feet. And again, I think it's worth noting who all's present for this event. Even Judas Iscariot is present. Can you imagine what it took for Jesus to wash the feet of the very man that literally in a few hours would betray Him? Would come into the garden and break the silence of the garden by kissing Him to identify Him to the Roman soldiers in the crowd and the mob. Jesus washes His feet, dressed like a servant. It's hard to fully comprehend, I think, the true magnitude of this passage. And the example that Jesus is setting, because you see, that's the whole purpose of what Jesus does. He wasn't doing it for the practical side, even though there was a practical side to it. Jesus was doing this for the very purpose of leaving them an example. Verse 15, "For I've given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you." The example's not in the feet washing, the specific act. As far as I'm aware, there's no historical evidence that this was any type of act or tradition that was passed down within the church of washing each other's feet. In many ways, Jesus gives them a living, breathing parable right in front of their own eyes. What He was giving them as an example was their attitude in service. It was to help them let go of this argument of who's the greatest. It's not about who's the greatest. If anyone in that room had the right to declare themselves the greatest, it was obviously Jesus. He said, "You call me teacher, and you're right, for I am." They recognized him as the Messiah. That's why they followed him. If anyone had the right to be recognized as the greatest, it was Jesus. But as he had told them back in Luke chapter 22, this is not about an earthly kingdom. This is not about who holds the position of authority, because you see, if you want to truly be great, you have to be willing to serve. And that was the example that Jesus was leaving for them. You do as I have done. Quit arguing over who's going to be the greatest. What you're going to need to do after I'm gone, you're going to need to serve. Because you see, with that authority and with that power that I'm about to bestow upon you, in the same way that I used my power to serve, I'm asking you to do the same. Because as he said in verse 16, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. You see, Jesus didn't view himself greater than God the Father, and he's telling his disciples, you don't view yourself as greater than me. And if I'm willing to serve in this way, then you should be willing to do the same. So I read this, I can't help but think about the words that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. As he was encouraging them to have an attitude of putting others before self, he would say this, beginning in chapter 2 of Philippians in verse 5. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So here the picture is this. Here's Jesus, who has equality with God in his grasp. That's what he was. He was God. He was equal with God. He was there in creation, but he didn't hold on to that so tightly that he wasn't willing to serve. He let it go. He let go of that equality with God. And he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. That word servant, really, we don't get the full significance of it. What it means is a slave. He took the form of a slave. And now you think about John chapter 13. Here's God, Jesus, the one who created, now serving the very thing he created. So what are the implications? First, I want to think about the implications for the apostles as they sat in this upper room. You know, they struggled, didn't they, understanding who Jesus really is? It was a battle for them in many ways throughout their 3 years with him on this earth. And it wasn't really until after his death and burial and resurrection and ultimately his ascension back to heaven, it wasn't until after all that that they truly started to grasp everything about Jesus. They wrestled with the physical versus the spiritual. They wrestled with this concept of wanting to be restored as a nation. They had literally spent hundreds of years, the Jews had, being oppressed by pagan countries and being under the rule of all these different leaders that they viewed as pagan and not recognizing God. And they just wanted to be restored back to what they thought was their rightful place as a nation. And even the apostles struggled, truly understanding the concept of the kingdom of heaven and the concept of Messiah and Christ and Lord. They certainly struggled with the concept of service, even though they had witnessed Jesus serve time and time and time again. They struggled with the concept of his impending death. And in this one moment, Jesus takes everything that his life had been about, and he displays literally, I believe, every characteristic of his mission on earth in this one act. We see him serve. He illustrates the point that if you want to be a part of me, you have to be washed by me. And we could make some type of theological connection or try to baptism, but I don't even think that's the primary point. I think the primary point is this. You want to be like me, you've got to allow me to immerse your life. You've got to allow me to wash your life. You've got to allow every aspect of me to penetrate you head to toe, holding nothing back in order to truly be like me. And I love Peter's response. All of me, Lord, from head to toe. He didn't understand it fully, what Jesus was saying, but he knew enough to say, hey, I want you and I want all of you. So what about us? What about the implications for you and me as we sit here this morning? Are we much different than the apostles when we really boil it down? I got to be honest. I'll speak for myself, and maybe you can just reflect upon yourself. I'm not sure I always see Jesus the way I should either. That may seem a little strange, doesn't it? You know, I see Jesus at times. I fully see Him as God, and I can appreciate that aspect of Him. But then I fail to see Him truly as human like me. And maybe I wrestle sometimes with truly believing in my heart. He wrestled with things like I do. He really wrestled with sin and temptation like I do. But yet He did. Or if I see Him in a human sense, maybe I don't fully recognize Him as Lord at those moments. And you know, maybe I'm more like the apostles than I want to believe sometimes. Maybe there's times I still think more about my rights and how I haven't received what I think I deserve, and maybe how other people have wronged me and hurt me, and I long for somehow having an opportunity to be restored back to what I think is my place. But yet what Jesus is calling to me and to all of us through the midst of our society and the things that pull us in different directions is, look at me. See my life. See what it means and see how I lived, and now see how you should interact with the world around you. And at the heart of how you and I should act at the world around us is an attitude and a heart of service. Not expecting anything in return. Not because we have some position of power, but because you and I are trying to follow in the footsteps of our Savior. Serving when people don't deserve it. Serving the very people that have harmed us or hurt us. You know, I had to look in the mirror this week. If Jesus can wash the feet of Judas Iscariot, I should be able to figure out how to serve people that I think have somehow offended me. But yet that's what Jesus is challenging you and me to do even this very morning. Lord, make me a servant. It's not easy to do. We sing a song sometimes. Make me a servant, Lord. Make me like you. For you are a servant. Make me one too. Make me a servant. Do what you must do. To make me a servant, make me like you. To love my brother, to serve like you do. I humble my spirit. I bow before you. And through my service, I'll be just like you. So make me a servant. Make me like you. Open my hands, Lord, and teach me to share. Open my heart, Lord, and teach me to care. For service to others is service to you. Make me a servant. Make me like you. You know, it really does start with allowing Christ to penetrate our hearts, doesn't it? Because you see, what you and I are tasked with now is we are to be the hands and the feet of Jesus. And it starts with how we serve each other, and then it extends to how we serve this community, and ultimately the impact that we can make even worldwide. Lord, make me a servant. Are you willing to serve Him this morning? Are you willing to give your life to Him, to allow Him to penetrate every aspect of your being so that we can say we've been bathed by Him like He told Peter? This morning, if we can help you in your relationship with Christ, whether it's initially getting to know Him better, we'd love to talk with you more about Jesus. Or if we can encourage you or support you in any way, shape, or form, we are here this morning as a church family to encourage each other. If you need prayers, if you just need an arm around you to let you know that you are loved or cared for, whatever we can do to help you this morning's invitation's yours. Just let us know now while together we stand and sing.